It's week 11 in the NFL, and we're focusing on the fantasy football waiver wire. We do that every week with SI senior fantasy football analyst Michael Fabiano. Fabs, week 10, it was kind of crazy. You may have a little bit of an emotional imbalance after watching some of these games, but let's focus on week 11. Who are you picking up for quarterbacks?
Man, fantasy football is not easy, my friend, especially in 2020. And there's not many good quarterbacks out there, folks. So I'll start off with Jameis Winston, who came in with Drew Brees injured. He hurt his ribs. He's going to have an MRI. And if Brees can't go next week, Jameis has got Atlanta, and that is a great matchup. Also, we told you to pick up Tua Tagovailoa last week. He's still not owned in many leagues on ESPN at 32.3%. He didn't have a huge game against the Chargers. He did have 2 touchdowns, though, 2 weeks in a row now with 2 touchdown passes. He's got the Broncos coming up. I mean, this kid has got all kinds of potential. So at the very least, he needs to be owned if he's not a week in and week out starter. Some other quarterbacks, Alex Smith. Now, he didn't have a touchdown pass, but he nearly threw for 400 yards. He's got the Bengals coming up next week. And then I'm going there, folks. Andy Dalton. I know it's Andy Dalton, but he's got the Vikings coming up. And for those who are desperate or in 2 QB leagues, Bill, I'm not saying to start him in traditional redrafts, okay? So don't get me twisted. But Andy Dalton could be worth a look in some deeper fantasy leagues. That's how thin quarterback is on the waiver wire right now, folks.
All right, let's move over to running backs. Fantasy football managers always looking for running backs, especially with those fantasy playoffs just 3 weeks away. Who are you eyeing up to get out of a couple backfields?
Nyheim Hines. I can't believe that this guy is only owned in 41% of leagues right now. And I get it. He's been really inconsistent, but it could be any Colts running back at any given moment because Frank Reich hates our fantasy football teams, right? He had 2 touchdowns against the Titans, nearly 30 fantasy points. The Packers are coming up. That's a really good matchup. So I don't know who's getting the ball in that backfield, Bill, but it could be Nyheim Hines. It was last week. And then Wayne Gallman. You want to talk about Rodney Dangerfield special? No respect. 4 straight games with a touchdown. He had 19 points against the Eagles. Now, the Giants are coming up on a bye week, but still, with Devonta Freeman on injured reserve, Gallman should be added. In Miami, Salvin Ahmed. This is where we're at, folks, at the running back position. 22 touches, 16 fantasy points against the Chargers. But here's the thing. If Matt Breida comes back in week 11, then Breida's the guy to add. So Breida and Ahmad should both be added across the board at the running back position. And speaking of Dolphins or former Dolphins, how about Kalen Ballage from Miami to the Jets, failed physical, free agent, goes to the Chargers on the practice squad. Now he has fantasy value. Welcome to 2020, right? 23 touches, 5 catches, over 15 fantasy points against the Dolphins in a revenge game, right? Now, week 11, they've got the Jets. That's a really good matchup. Just keep tabs on Austin Eckler in his return because hopefully he'll be back sooner rather than later. But right now, Bill Enright, Kalen Ballage has fantasy value. I don't know what to say, my friend.
That's all you need to say about 2020 as we head into week 11. Kalen Ballage fantasy relevant. Fabs, let's move over to the wide receiver position. What pass catchers are you looking at?
Michael Pittman Jr. looked great. Second week in a row where he was the guy in the Colts passing game at the wide receiver position. 8 targets, 7 catches, over 19 points against the Titans. He leads all Colts wide receivers in snaps, routes run, targets, catches, yards, and fantasy points in the last 2 weeks. And the matchup coming up against the Green Bay Packers, who are banged up. Speaking of the Packers, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, I like to call him MVS. Hey, he had another huge game, 149 yards, 1 touchdown, almost 25 fantasy points. He's now scored over 44 combined fantasy points in his last 2 games. But here's the issue. If Allen Lazard comes back, I'm going with him off the wire and not MVS. If Lazard can't come back, he's banged up, then it is Valdez-Scantling to target off the wire. A couple of other players, Jalen Reagor for the Eagles, 7 targets, 4 catches. Not a big game from a fantasy perspective, but he's running just as many routes as Travis Fulgham, and the targets are also there. Jakeem Grant for the Miami Dolphins, 5 targets, 4 catches, 80 yards and a touchdown. Preston Williams is out. They've got the Broncos coming up in week 11. You want to go a little bit deeper? Yeah, I'm saying Denzel Mims and Brashad Perriman. This is for only the faint at heart. because they do play for the Jets. But they have the Chargers coming up next week. So if you're in a deep league and you're desperate, because we don't want to just give you the big names, we want to give you everybody. So Denzel Mims, Rashad Perriman, worth a look in some deeper fantasy leagues.
And then finally, I know this position is one of the thinnest of all of fantasy football. That's tight ends.
Yeah, and Dalton Schultz is maybe the best ad off the waiver wire, and he didn't play this past week because the Cowboys were on a bye. At least we didn't lose, right? But Schultz has had 15 targets in his last 2 games. Like, that's a lot for a tight end. And Andy Dalton is expected to return against the Vikings. So Schultz is worth a look. Jordan Reed had a pretty good game for the Niners, right? 6 targets, 5 catches, over 11 fantasy points against the Saints. The problem is the Niners are coming up on a bye week. Here's another tight end to pick up, Logan Thomas for the Washington football team. 6 targets, 66 yards, almost 11 fantasy points. He's got 12 targets in his last 2 games. And Alex Smith likes to throw to the short and intermediate receivers. And Logan Thomas likes to do his work in the middle of the field. And before I let you go, I got to give some love to a kicker, all right? Tyler Bass. You got to be kidding me right now. This guy made field goals of 54 yards, 55 yards, 58 yards, scored 18 fantasy points. He's got 14 plus points and 3 of his last 4 games. I feel like he's better than Lamar Jackson at this point, right? And I'd be telling you to go and pick him up, but Buffalo's on a bye in week 11. So in week 12, I'm going to be talking to my friend Bill here, and I promise you I'm going to remind you to pick up Tyler Bass because kickers are people too.
Kickers are people too, and they can help you win your fantasy matchups. Every week, we hear people say, oh, his kicker scored this, her kicker scored this. Hey, if you have the best kicker, you don't have to worry about being outscored by your opposition. Fabs, great stuff as always. We have plenty more on our SI Fantasy Plus membership, which comes with your player rankings, our stardom situm, everything we have to offer for season-long fantasy football. It's just $14.99 a month. Go to si.com/fantasy for more info on how to sign up.